Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. This is the second half of the lecture of the American Revolution. We've just signed the Declaration of Independence and we're about to go to war against the most powerful nation in the world. But before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause, jot down the rest of the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the top. Now let's get started. So we signed the Declaration of Independence. It's an act of treason. We are now at war against the most powerful military force in the world. The question is now, how do you win this war? From both sides. We want to consider both perspectives here. So how do you win this war if you are the British? So I have a little handy checklist here for you. So number one, isolate. Britain needs to isolate, by using their navy, they need to isolate the American colonies. They need to prevent the colonies from engaging with allies and getting trade from other nations that would supply the war effort, whether it's food, clothing, or, of course, armaments, munitions. So number one, isolate. Number two, the British need to censor the press in any city they control. Why? The job of a government who is trying to prevent a rebellion or trying to put down unrest, one of the most important tools they can use is censor the free press. It's one of the reasons why it's a First Amendment right for the United States, the free press. Because if you can censor the press, you control the propaganda message. And once that message is gone, once the free press is gone, people stop rallying to the cause often because all they hear is one side of the equation. That's why we have a free press and why it's so important to have a diverse, sources going on in our society. Number three, enlist German mercenaries. Because quite honestly, a lot of the British soldiers in the colonies, of course, are fighting for the Americans, and now you have, a shortage of troops. Plus, don't forget, you've been fighting for forever now, it seems like. Number four, destroy the military capabilities of the Americans. And then number five, crush the rebellion quickly. The longer it goes, the more hope you give the Americans and the morale loss for the British. You need to crush this rebellion quickly. Oh, and then I have a little free one, a little bonus one, number 6 for you. Capture colonial leaders quickly to demoralize the enemy. In other words, get George. You gotta get George. You gotta get the leaders, but specifically capture General George Washington because he is the military leader. Now, if you're the Americans, you have a much simpler list, but it's really important. Number one, I always ask this to my students every year, what is the first thing you need if you're the British? And of course, they're like, well, guns. Well, okay. Ally. Yep, you need that. How about more basic? You need an army. Remember, so far you have a bunch of drunk farmers in the backwoods of Massachusetts who've been doing the fighting. You need a military, a trained, proper military. And then, yes, then you need allies, and then you also need to drag out the war. The longer the war goes, the better the odds of you winning. You will demoralize your enemy by dragging this war on. Now, both sides have different approaches to winning the war. And quite honestly, the top 4 for the British: censor the press in areas they control, the idea of isolation, hire mercenaries, destroy military capabilities. Check all those off. Those first 4 things, the British do with ease. However, the 2 most important ones are the number 5 and 6. Number 5, crush it quickly, and number 6, get the leaders, capture the political leaders, including especially George Washington, General. They can't get George. Despite those two things, though, the British are doing pretty well. The vast majority of Native Americans and African Americans, especially the slaves, will support the British. In addition, the British are able to overwhelm the unskilled and untrained Continental Army. But the big thing the British fail to do is crush it quickly, and they can't get George. Why? The British make a mistake, even though, if you would ask me, it sounds like a good idea. See, the thing was, the British decided to concentrate on the North. Now, if you remember correctly, when I showed you that in our last lecture, that the largest support for the revolution was from the Northeast in the New England area, right? And so the British decided that you should concentrate all your effort on the New England area and crush them first. Because if you do that, that's where your greatest support, if you're the revolutionaries, are. It will demoralize the rest of the country, the colonies, and basically they will just give up and surrender. It's fantastic, right? It makes logical sense. The problem is, for the British, by doing this and not succeeding in ending the war quickly, not succeeding in capturing colonial leaders, they get bogged down. They get stuck in the North. And one of the reasons they get stuck there is because of George Washington. Now, George does not win many battles. He really does not. And I'm not saying this to deride him. I'm not saying this to say he was a bad leader. No, quite the opposite. George was smart. Because George realized that his military could not take on his, they were trained, but not very well trained. His troops could not stand toe-to-toe against the most powerful military in the world, the British trained army, the British regulars. And therefore, George Washington minimized direct contact, or direct combat. He would shoot, he would run. George did what George does best, a skill he honed back at Fort Duquesne. George ran away. And so you can find George Washington running all over the New England countryside. He'll engage, he'll run. He'll engage, he'll run. And yes, it's a little more complicated than that if you actually get into all the bogged down the details. It's quite fascinating. Again, watch that oversimplified video I attached in the link, and it'll give you a better idea of a lot of the other smaller battles. But because George minimized direct combat and kept running away and focused on not getting caught, George ran. He's able to evade capture and keep hope alive as long as George is running. He's not captured. Hope is alive for the American colonists. Now, the turning point does not take place until October of 1777. Remember, this is talking 15 months after the war starts officially on July 4, 1776. And on October of 1777, we have the Battle of Saratoga. Now, the Battle of Saratoga, this becomes the turning point of the war, because this is really the first significant victory for George Washington. Now, he's had a couple minor wins here and there, but this is the first real win for George Washington, the Battle of Saratoga. The British Army actually surrenders. They don't run away. It's not just a moral victory. It's not unambiguous. 5,000 troops of the British Army surrender along with their weapons. Why is this important? Well, number one, it's a big victory that George needed because morale was quite low among his troops. People have talked about mutiny. But perhaps more important, this victory demonstrated to the world that America might just stand a chance. These colonists might stand a chance to win. And this begins to expand the war a great deal. Now, the British think it's a fluke, right? Everyone has a bad day. Anyone can win the lottery. Any football team can be any other football team any given Sunday, right? That's the old adages. So yeah, they can win. They won. So the British see it as a fluke. But this battle signaled to the world the Americans stand a chance. And France formally enters the war. Remember the end of the 7 Years' War? I told you that France and Spain were pissed off and waiting for a chance to strike back at the British. This is now their chance. Yeah, that was a good 15 years later. Right, I get it. But 15 years after the 7 Years' War ends, now the France and the Spanish get their chance at retaliation, revenge. And so in late 1777, France enters the war on behalf of the American colonists. And they become a formal ally of the American colonists. They provide weapons, troops, military training, very important, and their navy. And then in February 1778, another turning point with this, France formally recognizes the independence of the American colonies as a new nation. Again, this is important. You need a foreign power to recognize your independence to give legitimacy to your cause. This is important throughout history. Oh, and the Spanish, for their part, they don't join the war formally, but they begin to filter money and supplies, and especially ammunition, through the French to the Americans. So they don't enter it formally, but they will become a covert ally of the Americans as well. Again, this is all because they want revenge from the 7 Years' War. And hey, why not stick it to their, imperial power competitor, the British. Now, also after Saratoga, one more big thing happens. Even though the British think it's a fluke, they do begin to rethink their strategy. They say, you know what? Okay, you know what? We are getting bogged down here in the north. So here's what we're going to abandon the north. We're going to head south into the more southern colonies where we have more support. Remember, the biggest support for the cause, the Patriot cause, was in the north. The south, however, had a lot more loyalists, those Tories. And so they begin to think maybe we'll just abandon the north altogether. Maybe the small northeast will become their own country. We'll get the rest. Well, the plantations, all the cash crops, right? So they abandon the north and they focus on the energy in the south. They begin to go into these communities and set up loyalist support. And then once they feel the loyalists are in control, they move on to the next town. Well, the problem is, every time the British left a city, in comes the Americans, the American colonists, these Whigs, and they reestablished control over these cities. So really, the British never gained much. But what it did do was create many civil wars in these towns as Tories fought against Whigs, these loyalists against the Patriots in all these little cities. And we start seeing outbreaks in all these small southern lower colony cities between loyalists and patriots. Again, law and order does not exist. There's violence, there's chaos, there's public hangings, there's executions. Things are getting bad in the colonial South. The British, however, they realize this is not working again. So they redoubled down on their efforts to do the simple thing they need to do, capture George Washington. But every time they try, he evades capture. Again, George does what George does best. George runs all through the wilderness. Finally, as the war is dragging on, though, the British morale is declining. People back in Britain are saying, come on, seriously, these guys are a bunch of drunk farmers. How are they competing against the best army in the world? We no longer want to spend our money. Just give it up already. And you start seeing morale and support dwindle in England. And again, part of the reason they can't catch George. Now, the final big thing happens in 1781. In September 1781, the British finally hear credible intelligence. This is where George is at. They find out he's going to be at Yorktown. And so they finally said, okay, here's our chance to end this war. We will capture George. We will end this war now. And so in September of 1781, they go to attack George at Yorktown, only to find that there's a far larger army. 2 or 3 columns of colonial troops had gathered together at Yorktown, and suddenly the British were outnumbered. And the British, led by General Cornwallis, will retreat to the sea at a fort right on the water in Yorktown. And the plan is, for him, very simple. British ships are going to come down the coast, pick up Cornwallis and his men, and leave and fight another day. Unfortunately for the General Cornwallis, before the British ships can arrive, the French Navy arrives. And now they're stuck. George Washington and his men are surrounding the fort, laying siege to it by land, and the French Navy is blockading the fort at sea. Cornwallis is stuck. And finally, in September of 1781, for really only the second time in the war. Again, there's been minor, but for only the second time in the war, in October of 1781, the British are forced to wave the white flag and surrender. This surrender is going to break the will of the British public and of Parliament's opinion. Now, this is 1781, but this event becomes the last straw. It breaks the will of Parliament and the public opinion in Britain. And even though the fighting will continue for a couple more years until 1783, this essentially is going to end the American Revolution, this battle. But finally, in 1783, we will sign the Treaty of Paris of 1783. I told you it's coming back again. So there's the Treaty of Paris 1763, 7 Years' War, and the Treaty of Paris 1783, the American Revolution. Now, number one, most importantly, it grants the Americans their independence. And Great Britain formally recognizes their independence as well. We are a new nation. It also will outline the territory of this new nation, which basically says they have to the Mississippi, the British will remain in Canada, and Spain, for their trouble, will get back Florida. This victory, however, turns the world upside down, because the American Revolution is going to inspire other revolutions, such as the French Revolution a dozen years later. It's going to inspire the Haitian Revolution. It's going to inspire all the Latin American wars for independence in the following century. The biggest, baddest army in the world just got their butts handed to them by these colonists. And if the colonists can do it, well, why can't we? But it also, despite achieving independence, it leaves a lot of unanswered questions. For example, what is now our relationship with the mother country, the former mother country, Britain? I mean, they were our biggest trade partner before the war. Who's going to be our biggest trade partner now? And we already have these economic ties with Britain. Shouldn't we continue that? Or can we? In other words, if it was a Facebook status, it's complicated. Oh, there's also the whole thing of like, we need a new government. Yay, Thomas Paine, Republican government, all men created equal. Sounds great. Or maybe just a few people get equality here? Maybe. Let's talk about this. Number 3 problem. How do you pay off your debt? Because you have tremendous war debt here. You owe soldiers money. You have to pay back the French and the Spanish. You actually have to pay back the British also, because the British, part of the Treaty of Paris was you had to pay Britain for your independence. It's a nominal fee in some respects, but it's still a cost that you don't have money to do. And most importantly, maybe government's most important, but lastly on the list, the United States, this new country, is threatened all the time, is surrounded by their enemies. Think about it. You see the map in front of you, right? Let me put up one more map for you. Look at this one. So the map, you have 1775, you have 1783 on the right. The red area, of course, is the United States. The British are still in Canada. The people you just defeated in a, well, 7 long-year war is now directly to your north, just waiting waiting for you to stumble and pounce to take you back. You have the Spanish, who are in Mexico still, in the southwest United States and in Florida, just to your south. And guess what? You owe them money. And then you have the French, who are to the west of the Mississippi. And yeah, you don't see on the map there, but they get partial control of Louisiana. If you guys know your history going into 1800, they're going to be just west of the Mississippi in what is now, well, Louisiana, Missouri, etc. And so you have three major superpowers, all of whom you owe money to, all of whom are superpowers, imperial powers, colonizers, and they surround you. And you're a brand new country that want to create some weird form of new government and have no real idea what they're doing and have no way to pay back their debt. So we have some very real problems here. But for today, let's just celebrate the fact we are independent. We have a new nation. We just beat the most powerful military in the world, and we can celebrate with the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Actually, let's check that last remark. What does life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness really mean, and who does that really belong to? That is something, however, we will discuss in our next lecture. But until then, take care and bye-bye.